The rain had been falling for 3 days straight when Robert Callahan first noticed the dog. It was barely visible through the sheets of water cascading down his kitchen window, just a dark shape huddled against the old oak tree at the edge of his property. At first, he thought it might be a pile of debris that had blown in from somewhere, maybe a garbage bag or a bundle of wet leaves pushed together by the wind. But then the shape moved, just slightly, a trembling that spoke of cold and exhaustion, and Robert realized he was looking at something alive. He was 63 years old, a retired Army Ranger who had served 3 tours in Vietnam and 2 more in various conflicts that the government preferred not to discuss publicly. His body bore the marks of that service in ways both visible and hidden, from the shrapnel scars that traced silver lines across his back to the nightmares that still woke him at 2 in the morning, heart pounding, reaching for a weapon that wasn't there. He had been living alone in this farmhouse in rural Montana for almost 15 years now, ever since his wife Catherine had passed away from the cancer that had eaten her from the inside out while he held her hand and prayed to a God he wasn't sure he believed in anymore. The farmhouse was isolated, nearly 3 miles from the nearest neighbor and almost 10 from the small town of Pine Ridge that served as the commercial hub for this part of the county. That isolation suited Robert just fine. He had seen enough of humanity during his years of service to last several lifetimes, and the quiet of the Montana wilderness was a balm to a soul that had been scraped raw by decades of violence and loss. He had his books, his garden, his woodworking shop in the barn. He had the memories of Catherine that lingered in every room of the house they had shared. And he had his solitude, which was both a comfort and a curse depending on the day. But now there was a dog shivering against his oak tree in the middle of a storm that showed no signs of letting up. Robert pulled on his rain jacket and boots, muttering under his breath about the foolishness of going outside in weather like this. The sensible thing would be to wait until the storm passed, to let nature take its course. The dog had probably wandered away from some farm or campsite and would find its way back once the rain stopped. It wasn't his problem, wasn't his responsibility. But even as he thought these things, his feet were carrying him toward the door. His hand was reaching for the flashlight he kept on the hook by the entrance. Some instincts ran deeper than logic, and the instinct to help a creature in distress was one that Robert had never been able to suppress, no matter how much the world had given him reason to. The rain hit him like a wall of cold water the moment he stepped outside. He pulled the hood of his jacket over his head and trudged across the muddy yard toward the oak tree, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness like a sword. The dog didn't move as he approached, didn't even lift its head to acknowledge his presence. For a terrible moment, Robert thought he was too late, that the animal had already succumbed to the cold and the rain. Then he was close enough to see it clearly, and what he saw made his stomach clench with a mixture of horror and rage. The dog was emaciated, so thin that every rib was visible beneath its matted, sodden fur. It was a medium-sized animal, maybe 50 pounds when healthy, but clearly much less than that now. Its coat might have been golden once, but it was so dirty and tangled that it was hard to tell. And its eyes, when they finally opened to look at Robert, were the saddest eyes he had ever seen on any living creature. But that wasn't what made Robert's hands curl into fists at his sides. What made him want to find whoever had done this and introduce them to the skills he had spent decades perfecting was the burns. The dog's left side was covered in them, raw patches of exposed skin where the fur had been seared away. The wounds were partially healed, scarred over in some places and still angry red in others, suggesting that they were at least a few weeks old. Someone had burned this dog, intentionally and repeatedly from the pattern of the injuries, and then, apparently, they had left it to fend for itself, to starve and suffer and eventually die alone in the wilderness. Robert knelt in the mud, ignoring the water that soaked through his jeans. He held out his hand, moving slowly, letting the dog catch his scent before he tried to touch it. "Hey there," he said softly, his voice barely audible above the rain. "It's okay, I'm not going to hurt you." The dog flinched at first, its body tensing as if expecting a blow. But when Robert remained still, his hand extended and his voice gentle, something in the animal seemed to relax. It leaned forward, just slightly, and touched its nose to Robert's fingers. The contact was like an electric shock, a jolt of connection that went straight to Robert's heart. He had felt something similar twice before in his life, once when he had first met Catherine, and once when he had held his newborn daughter in his arms for the first and only time before the complications took her and shattered his wife's ability to have more children. It was the feeling of recognizing a soul that was meant to be part of his life, a bond that transcended reason or logic. "Okay," Robert said, his voice thick with emotion he hadn't expected to feel. "Okay, let's get you inside." He lifted the dog as gently as he could, mindful of the burns on its side. The animal was lighter than it should have been, its body wasted away to skin and bones. It whimpered softly as Robert cradled it against his chest, but it didn't struggle, seeming to understand that this human was trying to help rather than harm. The walk back to the house felt longer than it was, each step a battle against the mud and the wind and the weight of the suffering creature in his arms. When Robert finally made it through the door, kicking it shut behind him with his boot, he was soaked to the skin and breathing hard from the exertion. But the dog was inside now, safe and warm, and that was all that mattered. He laid the animal on a pile of old towels he kept by the door for occasions just like this, though he had never expected to use them for quite this purpose. The dog lay still, its eyes following Robert's movements as he grabbed more towels and began the careful process of drying its matted fur. "You're going to be okay," Robert murmured, working around the burns with a gentleness that might have surprised anyone who knew his history. "I've got you now. You're safe." The dog's tail gave a weak wag, the first sign of spirit it had shown since Robert had found it. That small movement, that tiny gesture of trust and hope, broke something open in Robert's chest that he had thought was permanently sealed. He was going to save this dog. He was going to find out who had done this to it, and he was going to make sure that justice was served, one way or another. The next morning, Robert woke to find the dog lying beside his bed, watching him with those sad, knowing eyes. He had set up a bed for it in the kitchen the night before, complete with soft blankets and a bowl of water, but apparently the animal had other ideas about where it wanted to sleep. "Okay," Robert said, sitting up and rubbing his eyes. "I guess we're doing this." The dog's tail wagged again, stronger this time, and it struggled to its feet to greet him. The movement clearly caused pain, the animal's legs trembling as it tried to support its weakened body, but it was determined to be near Robert, to maintain the connection that had formed between them in the storm. Robert spent the morning caring for his new companion. He cleaned the burns as best he could with the limited supplies he had on hand, applying antibiotic ointment and fresh bandages to the worst of the wounds. He prepared food, small portions of boiled chicken and rice that the dog devoured with a desperation that spoke of days or perhaps weeks without proper nutrition. And he made phone calls, first to the local veterinarian and then to the sheriff's department, reporting what he had found and requesting that someone look into the matter. The veterinarian, a woman named Dr. Sarah Chen, who had treated Robert's previous dog years ago, agreed to come out to the farmhouse that afternoon. She was one of the few people in the area who made house calls for emergencies, and Robert's description of the dog's condition had clearly qualified. The sheriff's response was less encouraging. Deputy Mitchell, who answered the phone, took down Robert's report with what sounded like perfunctory interest. "Dogs wandered off all the time," he said. "The burns could have been accidental. Maybe the animal had gotten too close to a campfire. There wasn't much the department could do without more information, but they would keep their eyes open." Robert hung up the phone with a familiar sense of frustration. He had dealt with enough bureaucracy during his military career to recognize dismissal when he heard it. The sheriff's department wasn't going to investigate a stray dog with burns, not when they had actual crimes to solve. If Robert wanted answers, he was going to have to find them himself. Dr. Chen arrived around 3 o'clock, driving her pickup truck carefully up the rutted dirt road that led to Robert's property. She was a small woman in her 50s, with gray-streaked black hair and the calm, competent demeanor of someone who had spent decades dealing with emergencies of all kinds. Robert met her at the door and led her to the living room, where the dog was lying on a pile of blankets he had arranged by the fireplace. The examination took nearly an hour. Dr. Chen was thorough and gentle, her hands moving over the dog's body with a tenderness that the animal seemed to sense and appreciate. She checked the burns, the teeth, the eyes, the internal organs as best she could without sophisticated equipment. And when she was finished, she sat back on her heels and looked at Robert with an expression that was difficult to read. "This dog has been through hell," she said quietly. "The burns are consistent with intentional abuse, probably inflicted with a heated object of some kind. They're at least 3 weeks old, maybe older. The malnutrition is severe, but not irreversible. With proper care and nutrition, she should be able to recover physically." "She?" Robert asked. Dr. Chen nodded. "She's female, probably around 3 or 4 years old based on her teeth. She's been spayed, which suggests she was someone's pet at some point. And Robert." She hesitated, her expression growing even more serious. "There's evidence of previous injuries, healed fractures in 2 of her ribs, scarring on her hind legs that could be from repeated trauma. This isn't the first time someone has hurt this dog. It's just the worst." Robert felt the rage building inside him again, the cold, controlled fury that had served him well on the battlefield and that he had worked so hard to suppress in civilian life. Someone had tortured this animal, repeatedly and deliberately, and then thrown her away like garbage when they were done. The thought made him want to break something, preferably the bones of whoever was responsible. "Can you tell anything else?" he asked, keeping his voice steady with an effort. "Anything that might help me figure out where she came from?" Dr. Chen shook her head. "No microchip, no collar, no identifying marks beyond the injuries. She could have come from anywhere. The closest houses are miles away, and there are camping sites and hiking trails all through these mountains. She might have been dumped deliberately, or she might have escaped and wandered until she found you." "She found me," Robert repeated, looking at the dog, who was watching the conversation with what seemed like understanding. "That's an interesting way to put it." "Dogs have a way of finding the people they need," Dr. Chen said, rising to her feet. "I've been doing this for 30 years, and I've seen things that I can't explain. Animals know more than we give them credit for. Maybe she knew that you would help her." Robert didn't believe in fate or destiny or any of the mystical nonsense that some people use to explain the inexplicable. But he couldn't deny that something about this felt significant, that the dog's appearance on his property in the middle of a storm seemed like more than coincidence. "What do I need to do?" he asked. Dr. Chen left him with a list of instructions: medications for the pain and infection, dietary guidelines for refeeding a starved animal, signs to watch for that would indicate complications. She promised to return in a week to check on the dog's progress, and she refused payment, saying that helping animals in need was why she had become a veterinarian in the first place. "What are you going to call her?" she asked as she was leaving. Robert looked at the dog, at the burns on her side, and the trust in her eyes. "Hope," he said. "I'm going to call her Hope." The days that followed were consumed by the slow, careful work of nursing Hope back to health. Robert fed her small meals every few hours, gradually increasing the portions as her stomach adjusted to the regular intake of food. He changed her bandages twice daily, watching with relief as the burns began to heal and new fur started to grow over the damaged skin. He talked to her constantly, a running monologue about nothing and everything, partly to help her get used to his voice, and partly because he had been alone for so long that having someone to talk to, even if that someone couldn't talk back, was a gift he hadn't known he needed. Hope responded to the care with a resilience that amazed him. Within a week, she was strong enough to walk around the house, following Robert from room to room with a devotion that never wavered. Within 2 weeks, she was venturing outside, exploring the property with a curiosity that suggested she was finally beginning to believe that the suffering was behind her. And within a month, she had transformed from the skeletal, trembling creature he had found in the storm into a beautiful dog with a coat that gleamed gold in the sunlight and eyes that sparkled with intelligence and affection. But there was one behavior that Robert couldn't explain, one quirk that persisted even as Hope's physical and emotional recovery progressed. Every morning, without fail, Hope would disappear into the woods behind the farmhouse. She would be gone for anywhere from 30 minutes to 2 hours, and when she returned, she would always be carrying something in her mouth. Usually it was a stick or a pine cone, sometimes a rock or a piece of trash that had blown in from somewhere. Robert assumed it was just a quirk, a habit she had developed during her time in the wilderness, and he didn't think much of it. Then, one morning, about 6 weeks after he had found her, Hope came back carrying something different. Robert was sitting on the porch, drinking his morning coffee and watching the sunrise over the mountains, when Hope emerged from the tree line. She walked toward him with purpose, her tail wagging, something dangling from her jaws. As she got closer, Robert felt his heart rate spike with sudden alarm. It was a piece of cloth, burnt cloth, charred and blackened, with tattered edges that suggested it had been torn from something larger, and it smelled, even from a distance, like smoke and ash, and something else, something that Robert's combat-trained senses recognized immediately. Accelerant. The cloth smelled like gasoline. Hope dropped the cloth at Robert's feet and sat down, looking up at him with an expression that seemed almost expectant. She had brought him something important, her eyes seemed to say. She had found something that he needed to see. Robert set down his coffee and picked up the cloth, examining it with hands that had gone suddenly cold. It was heavy cotton, maybe from a shirt or a jacket, and the burn pattern was consistent with something that had been doused in gasoline and set on fire. But that wasn't what made his breath catch in his throat. Embroidered in one corner of the cloth, partially obscured by the charring, but still visible if you knew where to look, was a logo. A small pine tree with the letters PRL beneath it. Pine Ridge Lumber, the largest employer in the area, a company that had been operating in these mountains for nearly a century. Robert had dealt with them a few times over the years, purchasing materials for his woodworking projects. He knew their logo well. He also knew that the owner of Pine Ridge Lumber, a man named Victor Hartley, had a reputation in the community that was decidedly mixed. On the surface, Hartley was a philanthropist and community leader, funding scholarships and sponsoring local events. But there were rumors, whispers that Robert had heard in the hardware store and the diner and the other places where locals gathered to share gossip. Rumors about Hartley's treatment of his employees, about deals gone wrong, and people who had crossed him disappearing from the area. Rumors about a temper that could turn violent without warning. And now, here was a piece of burnt cloth with Hartley's company logo on it, delivered to Robert's doorstep by a dog that had been tortured and abandoned. A dog whose burns, Robert suddenly realized, looked exactly like what you would expect from someone who had been doused in gasoline and set on fire. The pieces clicked together in Robert's mind with a cold, terrible clarity. Hope hadn't just wandered into his life by chance. She had been fleeing from something, from someone. And now she was trying to lead him back to whatever that something was. "Show me," Robert said, his voice rough. "Can you show me where you found this?" Hope's tail wagged, and she stood up, turning toward the tree line. She looked back at him over her shoulder, waiting for him to follow. Robert went into the house and retrieved his hiking boots, a flashlight, his phone, and the hunting knife he kept in a sheath by the door. He thought about calling the sheriff's department again, about reporting what he had found and letting the authorities handle it. But he remembered Deputy Mitchell's dismissive tone, the perfunctory way his initial report had been handled. They wouldn't take a piece of burnt cloth seriously, wouldn't follow a starving dog into the wilderness based on nothing but a hunch and a logo. If Robert wanted answers, he was going to have to find them himself. Hope led him into the forest, following paths that only she could see. The terrain was rough, the ground covered with fallen leaves and tangled undergrowth that made every step a challenge. But the dog moved with confidence, pausing occasionally to make sure Robert was still following, then continuing on her mysterious journey. They walked for nearly an hour, climbing steadily uphill into the mountains. Robert's legs began to burn with the exertion, his breathing growing heavy as the altitude increased. He wasn't as young as he used to be, and years of relatively sedentary living had taken their toll on his endurance. But he pushed through the discomfort, driven by a determination that surprised him. Finally, Hope stopped at the edge of a small clearing. She sat down and looked at Robert, then turned her gaze towards something on the other side of the open space. Robert followed her eyes and felt the blood drain from his face. There was a cabin there, or what was left of one. The structure had clearly been destroyed by fire, its walls reduced to charred timbers, and its roof collapsed into a pile of ash and debris. The ground around it was scorched and blackened, and even from a distance, Robert could smell the lingering scent of smoke and gasoline. But that wasn't what made him reach for his phone with shaking hands. What made him dial 911 for the first time in years was what he saw lying in the debris, partially buried beneath the collapsed roof. A human hand, motionless and pale, reaching out from beneath the rubble as if pleading for help that had never come. The next few hours were a blur of activity and official response. Robert's 911 call brought not only the sheriff's department, but also the county fire department, the state police, and eventually a team of crime scene investigators who treated the site with a gravity that confirmed Robert's worst fears. This wasn't an accident. This was a murder scene. The body belonged to a man named Carlos Mendez, a former employee of Pine Ridge Lumber who had been reported missing nearly 2 months ago. He had been dead before the fire started, the investigators determined, killed by blunt force trauma to the head. The fire had been set to cover up the murder, to destroy evidence and make identification difficult. It would have worked, too, if not for the remote location of the cabin and the dense forest that had limited the fire's spread. And if not for Hope, who had somehow survived whatever had happened here and made her way to Robert's farmhouse, carrying with her the evidence that would eventually unravel the entire case. The investigation moved quickly once the body was found. Carlos Mendez, it turned out, had been more than just a lumber company employee. He had been a whistleblower, gathering evidence of illegal logging operations on protected federal land, operations that had been authorized and covered up by none other than Victor Hartley himself. Carlos had been planning to go to the authorities with his evidence when he disappeared. His evidence had been kept in the cabin, along with his dog, a golden retriever named Esperanza that he had adopted from a shelter years ago. Esperanza, who Carlos had loved with the devotion of a man who had grown up with nothing and treasured every good thing that came into his life. Esperanza. Hope. Robert sat in the sheriff's station, listening as the investigators pieced together the story from evidence and interviews and the digital trail that Carlos had left behind. Victor Hartley had discovered Carlos's plans and had confronted him at the cabin. There had been a fight, a blow to the head, a body that needed to be disposed of. The fire had been meant to destroy everything, including the dog that had witnessed her owner's murder and might somehow give away what had happened. But Esperanza had escaped. Badly burned and traumatized, she had fled into the wilderness, surviving on instinct and whatever food she could find. She had wandered for weeks, gradually making her way through the mountains until she had finally collapsed against an oak tree on Robert's property, too exhausted to go any further. And then, once she had recovered, she had led her rescuer back to the scene of the crime. She had brought him the evidence that would bring her owner's killer to justice. Victor Hartley was arrested 3 days later. The case against him was overwhelming. Built on the burnt cloth with the company logo, the accelerant residue that matched gasoline purchased at a station near his home, and the testimony of witnesses who had seen him near the cabin in the days before the fire. He protested his innocence, hired expensive lawyers, tried to use his wealth and influence to escape the consequences of his actions. But the evidence was too strong, and the public outrage was too great. He was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The illegal logging operation was shut down, the protected lands were restored, and Carlos Mendez was buried with honors in the cemetery where his parents had been laid to rest years before. And Hope, the dog, who had survived torture and abandonment and led her rescuer to the truth, became a national sensation. The story was picked up by local news outlets first, then regional ones, then national networks that couldn't resist the narrative of a loyal dog avenging her owner's death. Robert found himself giving interviews, appearing on morning shows, trying to explain how a starving stray with burns on her side had changed his life and brought a killer to justice. He didn't enjoy the attention. He had spent too many years avoiding the spotlight, too many years preferring the quiet solitude of his farmhouse to the chaos of public life. But he understood that the story was bigger than his comfort, that it spoke to something deep in the human heart about loyalty and justice and the bonds that could form between species. And he understood that Hope deserved to have her story told, that Carlos Mendez deserved to be remembered as more than just a victim. As the weeks passed and the media frenzy gradually subsided, Robert and Hope settled into a new normal. She was officially his dog now, the paperwork having been handled by a lawyer who was moved by the case and volunteered his services. She slept on his bed, ate meals at his feet, accompanied him on walks through the property that had become their shared home. The burns on her side healed into smooth scars that were barely visible beneath her golden fur. The trauma of what she had witnessed faded, gradually replaced by the security and love that Robert provided. And the sadness that had been in her eyes when he first found her gave way to something brighter, something that looked like peace. Robert found that he was changing too, in ways he hadn't expected. The isolation that had once been his refuge began to feel less necessary, the walls he had built around his heart becoming more permeable. He started accepting invitations to community events, reconnecting with neighbors he had avoided for years, even considering the possibility of dating again for the first time since Catherine's death. Hope had brought him back to life, just as he had brought her back from the brink of death. They had saved each other, in the way that only those who have known suffering can truly save. 1 year after he had found her in the storm, Robert sat on his porch with Hope at his feet, watching the sunset over the mountains. The sky was painted in shades of orange and pink and purple, a canvas of beauty that seemed to stretch on forever. In the distance, he could hear the sounds of the forest settling into night, the calls of birds and the rustle of small animals and the whisper of wind through the trees. "Thank you," he said softly, reaching down to scratch Hope behind the ears, "for finding me, for trusting me, for showing me that there was still something worth fighting for." Hope's tail wagged, and she leaned into his touch with a contented sigh. She had found her home, her person, her purpose. The suffering was behind her, and the future stretched out before them like a promise waiting to be fulfilled. Robert didn't know what that future would hold. He was 64 years old now, with more years behind him than ahead. But for the first time in a long time, he was looking forward to finding out. He had a companion who loved him unconditionally, a community that had embraced him despite his years of isolation, and a story that reminded him every day of the power of loyalty and courage and the unbreakable bonds between those who choose to love each other. The starving dog who had carried a burnt cloth to his door had given him all of that. She had given him hope in every sense of the word. The seasons turned, as they always do, bringing with them changes both expected and surprising. The first winter after Hope's arrival was harsh, with snowdrifts that reached nearly to the windows and temperatures that plunged well below zero. But the farmhouse was warm, the wood stove burning day and night, and Robert found that he didn't mind the cold as much as he had in previous years. Having Hope beside him made even the darkest days bearable. Spring brought new life to the property, with wildflowers blooming in the meadow and birds returning to nest in the trees. Robert threw himself into his garden with renewed energy, expanding the vegetable plots and adding beds of flowers that Catherine had always wanted but he had never gotten around to planting. Hope helped in her own way, lying in the sun while he worked and occasionally digging holes in places where holes were definitely not needed. Summer was long and golden, filled with hikes through the mountains and afternoons spent reading on the porch while Hope dozed at his feet. Robert started taking longer walks, pushing himself to explore areas of the wilderness that he had avoided for years. His body was stronger than it had been in a long time, his mind clearer, his spirit lighter. He was living again, truly living, and it felt like a miracle that he had never expected to experience. But the greatest miracle came in the fall, almost exactly 1 year after he had found hope in the storm. It started with a letter delivered by the postal carrier who made the long drive out to Robert's farmhouse once a week. The envelope was plain, with no return address, and Robert almost threw it away as junk mail. But something made him open it, some instinct that told him this was important. Inside was a single sheet of paper, handwritten in a careful, elegant script that Robert didn't recognize. The letter read, "My name is Maria Mendez. I am the sister of Carlos Mendez, whose murder you helped solve through your care of his dog, Esperanza. I have wanted to write to you for months, but could not find the words to express what I feel. Carlos was my only brother, the last remaining member of my immediate family. When he disappeared, I feared the worst but could not prove anything. The police were no help, and Victor Hartley's influence in the community meant that no one was willing to ask questions. I had given up hope of ever knowing what happened to my brother. And then you found Esperanza. You took her in, healed her wounds, and followed her back to the truth. Because of you, my brother's killer is in prison. Because of you, I can finally grieve properly, knowing that Carlos did not die in vain. I cannot thank you enough for what you have done, but I hope you will allow me to try. I live in Seattle now, where I work as a nurse. I have been following your story in the news and have been touched by the bond you have formed with Esperanza. I know that she has found a good home with you, and I would never dream of taking her away. But I was hoping that perhaps I could visit sometime, to meet the man who saved my brother's dog, and to see for myself that she is happy and healthy. Please let me know if this would be acceptable to you. With deepest gratitude, Maria Mendez." Robert read the letter 3 times, his hands trembling slightly. He had thought of Carlos Mendez often since the case had been solved, had wondered about the man who had loved Hope enough to risk everything for her. But he had never imagined that Carlos had family, that someone out there was grieving his loss and searching for closure. He wrote back that same day, telling Maria that she was welcome to visit whenever she wished. He gave her his phone number, his email address, directions to the farmhouse. And he told her about Hope, about how the dog had transformed his life and brought him back from the brink of despair. Maria's response came a week later, a phone call that lasted nearly 2 hours, as they shared stories about Carlos, about Hope, about their own lives and struggles, and hopes for the future. Robert learned that Maria was 47 years old, widowed like himself, with 2 grown children who lived on the East Coast. He learned that Carlos had been the baby of the family, the dreamer who had always believed that one person could make a difference in the world. And he learned that Maria had been devastated by her brother's death, but had found some measure of peace in knowing that his killer had been brought to justice. "He would have loved you," Maria said near the end of the call, her voice thick with emotion. "He always said that the best people were the ones who showed kindness to animals, who saw the value in creatures that couldn't speak for themselves. You took care of Esperanza when she needed it most. Carlos would have considered you a true friend." Robert didn't know how to respond to that. He had never thought of himself as particularly kind or compassionate. He had simply done what needed to be done, what any decent person would have done in his situation. But Maria's words touched something deep inside him, a need for connection that he had suppressed for far too long. Maria visited for the first time in late October, driving up from Seattle in a rental car that struggled with the rough roads leading to Robert's property. She was a tall woman with dark hair streaked with gray and kind eyes that reminded Robert of Hope's, full of warmth and understanding and a sadness that never quite went away. Hope recognized her immediately. The moment Maria stepped out of the car, the dog was there, pressing against her legs, tail wagging furiously, making sounds of joy that Robert had never heard her make before. Maria knelt in the driveway and wrapped her arms around Hope's neck, tears streaming down her face, whispering words in Spanish that Robert couldn't understand but felt in his heart. "She remembers me," Maria said, looking up at Robert with wonder. "I used to visit Carlos at the cabin sometimes. Esperanza would always be there, always so happy to see me. I never thought I would see her again." Robert watched the reunion with a complicated mix of emotions. He was glad that Hope remembered her past, that she had people who loved her beyond just him, but he couldn't help feeling a flicker of fear, a worry that Maria would want to take Hope back with her, that he would lose the companion who had become the center of his world. Maria seemed to sense his concern. "I'm not going to take her," she said, rising to her feet and placing a hand on Robert's arm. "I can see how much she loves you, how happy she is here. This is her home now. I just wanted to see her, to know that she was okay, and to meet you." The tension drained from Robert's shoulders, replaced by a relief so profound that it almost made him dizzy. "She's more than okay," he said. "She's the best thing that ever happened to me." Maria smiled, a genuine smile that transformed her face. "I believe it. Carlos always said that Esperanza had a gift for finding people who needed her. I think she found exactly where she was meant to be." That first visit lasted 3 days, during which Robert and Maria talked for hours about everything and nothing. They discovered shared interests in books and gardening and the quiet beauty of nature. They shared stories about their spouses, about the grief that had shaped their lives, about the slow and difficult process of learning to live again after loss. And they walked through the property with Hope between them, watching as the dog explored her domain with a joy that seemed to increase whenever she looked back and saw them both there. When Maria left, promising to return soon, Robert felt an unexpected pang of loneliness that had nothing to do with his usual solitude. He had enjoyed her company more than he had enjoyed anyone's in years. She was easy to talk to, easy to be around, easy in a way that reminded him of Catherine, but was also entirely her own. Hope seemed to feel it too. She stood at the window for hours after Maria's car disappeared down the road, watching the empty driveway with an expression that Robert recognized from his own mirror. "I know, girl," he said, sitting beside her and scratching behind her ears. "I miss her too." Maria returned a month later, and then again a month after that. Each visit was longer than the last, each goodbye harder to say. Robert found himself counting the days between her visits, found himself looking forward to her calls and emails with an anticipation that he hadn't felt since his early days with Catherine. And slowly, tentatively, he began to acknowledge the truth that Hope had probably understood from the beginning. He was falling in love. The realization terrified him. He was 64 years old, set in his ways, scarred by experiences that most people couldn't imagine. He had already had one great love in his life, had lost her to a disease that had taken her piece by piece while he watched helplessly. The idea of opening himself up to that kind of vulnerability again, of risking that kind of pain, seemed almost unbearable. But when Maria was there, sitting across from him at the kitchen table or walking beside him through the meadow, the fear seemed less important than the connection he felt. She understood him in ways that no one had since Catherine, saw past his gruff exterior to the wounded man beneath. And Hope adored her, which seemed like the most important endorsement of all. It was Hope, in fact, who finally forced Robert to confront his feelings. Maria had come for her usual visit, a long weekend in early spring that happened to coincide with Robert's 65th birthday. She had brought a cake that she had baked herself and a present wrapped in paper decorated with dogs that looked remarkably like Hope. They had spent the day together, hiking to a waterfall that Robert had discovered on one of his explorations, eating lunch on a flat rock overlooking the valley, talking about everything and nothing, as they always did. That evening, as the sun was setting and they were sitting on the porch with Hope at their feet, Maria suddenly stood up and announced that she needed to go inside for a moment. She returned a few minutes later with a look on her face that Robert couldn't quite read, part nervous and part determined. "I have something to tell you," she said, sitting back down in her chair, "and I don't want you to say anything until I'm finished." Robert nodded, his heart suddenly pounding with a fear that he couldn't explain. "I've been offered a job," Maria continued, "a position as head nurse at a clinic in Pine Ridge. It would mean moving here, to Montana, leaving Seattle behind. It would mean starting over, at my age, in a place where I barely know anyone except you." She paused, taking a deep breath. "The truth is, I've already accepted the position. I start next month. I've rented an apartment in town, nothing fancy, just enough space for me and my things. And I told myself that I was doing this for practical reasons, for the job and the change of scenery and the chance to be closer to my brother's memory." Her eyes met Robert's, and in them he saw something that made his breath catch. "But that's not really why I'm doing it. I'm doing it because of you. Because in the months that I've been coming to visit, you've become the person I most want to see, the person I think about when I wake up and when I go to sleep. I'm doing it because I've fallen in love with you, Robert Callahan, and I couldn't stand the thought of only seeing you a few times a year." The silence that followed her confession seemed to stretch on forever. Robert sat frozen in his chair, unable to speak, unable to move, barely able to breathe. This was everything he had been afraid to hope for, everything he had convinced himself could never happen. And now it was here, sitting in front of him, waiting for a response that he didn't know how to give. Hope saved him, as she always did. The dog stood up from her position at Robert's feet and walked over to Maria. She pressed her head against Maria's leg, then turned and looked at Robert with an expression that seemed almost impatient. Her tail wagged once, twice, then stopped as she continued to stare at her person with those knowing eyes. "I think she's trying to tell you something," Maria said, her voice trembling with laughter and tears. Robert looked at Hope, at this impossible dog who had survived torture and starvation and a murderer's attempt to silence her. The dog who had brought him back to life, who had shown him that it was never too late to start again, who had led him not just to the truth about her owner's death, but to a truth about himself that he had been avoiding for years. "She's telling me to stop being a fool," Robert said. And then he was on his feet, crossing the distance between them, pulling Maria into his arms in an embrace that felt like coming home. "I love you too," he whispered against her hair. "I've loved you for months. I was just too afraid to admit it." Maria pulled back just enough to look into his eyes, her face wet with tears but radiant with joy. "You're not afraid anymore?" Robert thought about all the fears that had ruled his life since Catherine's death. The fear of connection, of vulnerability, of opening himself up to the possibility of loss. They were still there, lurking in the corners of his mind. But they were smaller now, less powerful, overshadowed by something stronger. "I'm terrified," he admitted, "but I'm more afraid of losing you than I am of loving you. And Hope seems to think you're worth the risk." As if on cue, Hope barked once, a sound of approval that made them both laugh. The dog wriggled between them, demanding to be included in the embrace, and for a long moment they stood there together, the three of them, bound by a love that had started with suffering and grown into something beautiful. Maria moved to Pine Ridge a month later, into the apartment she had rented in town. She started her new job, quickly earning a reputation as one of the best nurses the clinic had ever had. And she spent every moment she could spare at Robert's farmhouse, helping with the garden, taking walks through the wilderness, building a life with the man and the dog who had become her family. They were married 6 months later, in a small ceremony on Robert's property, with Hope serving as the unofficial ring bearer. The guest list was small, just a few neighbors and Maria's children and Dr. Chen, who had continued to care for Hope throughout her recovery. But the love that filled the meadow that day was immense, a testament to the power of second chances and the unexpected paths that life could take. The story of how they came together spread through the community, adding another chapter to the legend of the starving dog who had carried a burnt cloth to a veteran's door. People were moved by the romance that had blossomed from tragedy, by the idea that love could be found in the most unlikely of circumstances. The local newspaper did a feature on them, and regional outlets picked it up, and for a few weeks they were minor celebrities in a narrative that seemed too remarkable to be true. But for Robert and Maria, the attention was secondary to the life they were building together. They merged their households, with Robert adding a room onto the farmhouse for Maria's belongings, and Hope gaining a dedicated space for the bed and toys she had accumulated over the years. They established routines and traditions, morning coffee on the porch and evening walks through the meadow, and Sunday dinners that became legendary in the neighborhood for their warmth and hospitality. And through it all, Hope was at the center of everything, the thread that connected their stories and the catalyst that had brought them together. She was 8 years old now, no longer young, but still vibrant, still curious, still devoted to her people, with a love that seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. The scars on her side had faded to faint lines, barely visible beneath her golden fur. The trauma of her past had healed, replaced by the security and love that surrounded her in her forever home. And when she looked at Robert and Maria, sitting together on the porch or working side by side in the garden, her tail wagged with a contentment that spoke of a soul finally at peace. Robert often thought about the journey that had brought them all to this point, the storm that had driven Hope to his property, the burnt cloth that she had carried to his door, the investigation that had uncovered a murder and brought a killer to justice, the friendship with Maria that had deepened into love. Each step had seemed random at the time, a series of coincidences and choices that could easily have gone differently. But looking back, he could see the pattern, the thread that connected everything together. Hope had found him because he needed to be found. She had shown him the truth because he needed to see it. And she had led Maria into his life because she knew, somehow, that they were meant to be together. Dogs knew things, Dr. Chen had told him once. They understood more than humans gave them credit for. Robert believed that now, believed it with every fiber of his being. 3 years after he had found her in the storm, Hope passed away peacefully in her sleep, surrounded by the people who loved her. She was 11 years old, ancient by some measures, but still vital until the very end. Her final day had been a good one, filled with treats and walks and an outpouring of affection that seemed to know no bounds. And when Robert found her the next morning, her eyes closed and her body still, he knew that she had chosen her moment, that she had waited until she was sure he would be okay. The grief was immense, a weight that pressed down on his chest and made every breath an effort. Maria held him while he cried, understanding his loss in a way that only someone who had known Hope could understand. They buried her in the meadow, beneath the oak tree where Robert had first found her, with a stone that bore a simple inscription. Hope. She found us when we were lost. In the weeks that followed, Robert often found himself walking to that spot in the meadow, sitting beside the stone and talking to Hope as if she could still hear him. He told her about his days, about the garden and the woodworking and the life he was building with Maria. He told her about the letters that still arrived occasionally from people who had been inspired by her story to adopt rescue dogs of their own. And he told her how much he missed her, how the house felt emptier without her there, how he would give anything to feel her warm weight against his leg one more time. Maria joined him sometimes, sitting beside him in the grass, adding her own words to the conversation. They spoke of Carlos, of the brother and friend who had loved Hope first, who had died protecting the truth and been avenged by the dog he had rescued from a shelter years ago. They spoke of the strange and beautiful path that had led them all to this moment, the tragedies and triumphs that had shaped their lives. And they spoke of gratitude for the time they had been given and the love they had shared and the memories they would carry with them always. Time passed, as it always does. The meadow bloomed with wildflowers each spring, the oak tree growing taller and stronger with each passing year. Robert and Maria grew older together, their hair turning gray, their steps slowing, their love deepening with every shared moment. They adopted another dog eventually, a golden retriever rescue they named Faith, who brought joy and chaos back into the farmhouse that had grown too quiet after Hope's passing. But Hope was never forgotten. Her photograph hung in the living room, beside pictures of Catherine and Carlos and all the others who had passed on but remained present in memory. Her story was told to visitors, to neighbors, to the children who came with their parents to see the famous veteran and his legendary dog. And her spirit seemed to linger in the meadow, in the whisper of wind through the grass and the warmth of sunlight on the stone that marked her final resting place. Robert lived to be 82 years old, outliving every prediction that the doctors had made during his years of military service. He died on a summer evening, sitting on the porch with Maria beside him and Faith at his feet, watching the sunset over the mountains he had loved for so long. His final words were about hope, about the starving dog who had carried a burnt cloth to his door and changed his life forever. "She found me," he whispered, his eyes fixed on something beyond the horizon. "When I was lost, she found me." And then he was gone, passing peacefully from one world to the next, leaving behind a legacy of love and courage and the unbreakable bond between a man and his dog. Maria scattered his ashes in the meadow, beside Hope's grave, where he had asked to be laid to rest. She spoke at the memorial service about the man she had loved, about his strength and gentleness, and the transformation that had occurred when a starving stray had appeared on his property during a storm. She spoke about hope, about Carlos, about the thread that connected them all across time and tragedy. And she spoke about love, the love that had sustained them through darkness and loss, the love that had made every moment precious. The story continued to be told long after the principals had passed on. It was shared in books and articles, in documentaries and social media posts, in the quiet conversations between strangers who had been touched by its power. The story of a starving dog who carried a burnt cloth to a veteran's door, who revealed a murder and sparked a love story, and reminded everyone who heard it that hope could be found in the most unexpected places. And sometimes, on quiet evenings, when the wind blew through the meadow and the sun painted the sky in shades of gold and rose, visitors to the property claimed to see something in the distance, a golden shape, running through the grass with a joy that seemed to transcend the physical world. A dog who had suffered and survived and loved with a devotion that death itself could not diminish. Hope, still running, still finding those who needed to be found, still reminding the world that even in the darkest moments, salvation could come on four legs, carrying with it the promise of healing and the unshakable faith that love would always find a way. The discovery that had shocked everyone had become a story that inspired everyone. And in that transformation, in that journey from tragedy to triumph, the starving dog with the burnt cloth had achieved something that would endure long after the last person who had known her had passed on. She had become a legend, a symbol, a reminder that the bonds between humans and animals could change the world. And somewhere beyond the veil, in whatever place awaits those who have loved and been loved, a veteran and his dog were reunited at last, running together through fields that had no end, their journey finally complete.